All right. I'm going to go ahead and Maribel, I'm going to get started. Can you hear me over on Facebook Live? Are we good?
Yes, we are good.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenido. I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the fourth of a six-part webinar series focused on anti-racism. My name is Patricia Lopez, and I'm assistant professor in the Kremen School of Education and Human Development at Fresno State. And I'm also the director of Enseñamos en el Valle Central, which is the honor of hosting the series on anti-racism today. As we do in each of our webinar openings, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather as Fresno State faculty on the traditional lands of the Yokuts and Mono peoples, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Acknowledging the land is an important Indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today and is an integral part of consciousness raising and explicit expressions of anti-racism and anti-racist epistemologies. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well, including the recognition of these communities, that these communities are still present and the struggle for sovereignty continues. To all of our future and current educators that are joining us today, again, welcome. I want to express the importance of land recognition as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside on, where you teach, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that that has brought us to reside on the land, and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or in historical context. Some may, compel us to think in that way, but colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. And on the heels of October 12th, last week, I want to remind our educators that it's okay to go beyond single day or single month celebration of peoples and culture, Indigenous peoples' merit being recognized daily. On that note, I invite all of you listening via Zoom and on Facebook, feel free to use the chat box and comment box. I think some of you are already doing that. Acknowledge the Native peoples whose lands you're currently occupying. Acknowledge and pay honor to your own Indigenous roots and ancestors. Call them into the space to help guide us all as we continue this journey of embodying anti-racism. For those of you who have been with us in previous webinars, I just want to welcome you back and thank you for coming back and being here. If this is your first time participating in an event sponsored by Enseñamos en el Valle Central, we welcome you. I want to briefly share that we are a federal funded Title V initiative focused on cultivating future educators with a commitment to equity, justice, liberation, anti-racism. A very integral part of our approach to cultivating future educators, or what some refer to as growing our own, is an explicit commitment to culturally and linguistically sustaining and ethnic studies pedagogies that are grounded in anti-deficit, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive frameworks, valuing service to community, political awareness, and critical civic engagement for the public good. The vision and principles that we uphold as an initiative are grounded and informed by a long history of community struggles for access to the teaching profession and an education system that reflects the racialized experiences and contributions of those it serves. A system that does away with racial, cultural, economic, and linguistic hierarchies by first owning the fact that they exist. These gatherings are examples of how we put our vision and mission into practice, the coming together of faculty, scholars, and teacher education, and today even scholars outside of teacher education who are committed to sharing knowledge and supporting future and current educators who aspire to embody anti-racist epistemologies. Educators like many of you who strive to affirm rather than condemn difference. With that said, it's important to historicize the topic of anti-racism and acknowledge that this concept has deep roots in abolition, the call to end slavery, and the call for structural changes in eradicating institutional racism in a post-emancipation society. These movements are very much alive today, as we've noted in every other webinar notably through the Black Lives Matter movement, whereby activists and educators alike specifically invoke terms like abolition, anti-racist, and anti-racism to underscore the importance of individuals understanding the historic and ongoing racial disparities and how those disparities are deeply rooted in power, policies, and practices. We must also recognize the thousands, if not millions, of Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color across the country who are currently trying to exercise their right to vote in the midst of voter suppression that's very much tied to these movements we see today. In our previous webinars, we delved deep into the topics of anti-Black racism, anti-Blackness, and nativism as processes that dehumanize by stripping Blackness of value, by stripping human rights from people without certain documents, and altogether systematically marginalize certain racialized groups. These processes are in part upheld and perpetuated through the instrumentation of certain scientific and mathematical reasonings, ideologies, and epistemologies that continue to inform how we structurally and interpersonally understand our society, social issues, and different peoples. Our presenters today are going to help us unpack these nuances and how these processes find expression throughout our society, in our institutions, in our schools, and in our classrooms. How these processes reinforce racialized narratives that constitute of what constitutes truth, facts, and knowledge, and whose knowledge matters. In the spirit of anti-racism and recognizing the possibilities of anti-racist pedagogies, our presenters are also going to share how anti-racist educators navigate these ideological systems while striving to transform them at the classroom level and beyond. So with that, let us be inspired to think differently about how we embody and enact anti-racism in and out of school settings. For those of you who are tweeting, we ask that you please use the hashtag EnseñamosPLC that you see here on your screen, and follow and tag us on social media at FS Enseñamos. I'm going to now turn it over to my amazing colleague, Dr. Maria Goff, to transition us to the panelists. Gracias, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. I'm going to describe our format today and introduce our panelists. So as I'm going over our format, if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. If you're teaching or student teaching, you could tell us the grade level and content area that you're teaching to give us an idea of who all is here. So we have 3 panelists today, and each of our panelists will have about 15 minutes to present. So during that time, you can use the chat to submit questions, and then you can also submit questions using the Q&A box if you're on Zoom. If you're on Facebook Live, we'll do our best to field your questions to the panelists. And then in between each of our panelists, you'll see some polling questions come up in Zoom for you to answer. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please note that in your question when you type it in the Q&A box. And the panelists will answer your questions after all 3 presentations. So our first panelist today is Dr. Rohit Mehta. Dr. Mehta is an assistant professor of curriculum with instructional technology in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at California State University, Fresno. Dr. Mehta teaches educational psychology courses from critical and humanizing perspectives. He writes on the intersections of education and colonization, creativity, and technology. His collaborations have been published in academic journals like Thinking Skills and Creativity. As an educator, Dr. Mehta wants to help teachers foster teaching and learning practices that are inclusive of multiple ways of being, knowing, and doing, and not rooted in histories of oppression. Our second panelist is Dr. Mario Banuelos. Dr. Banuelos is an assistant professor of mathematics at California State University, Fresno. His research interests include mathematical biology, optimization, statistical models for genome evolution, and data science. Through his research group at Fresno State, he hopes to bring more research opportunities and innovation to the Central Valley. And our third panelist is Dr. Sergio Juarez. Dr. Juarez is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at California State University, Fresno. Before coming to Fresno State, Dr. Juarez was a lecturer for CSU Channel Islands, Loyola Marymount University, and CSU Northridge. His research interests are currently centered on education contexts, influencing his goals that include the development of new institutional structures by leveraging technology to construct anti-colonial inclusive education practices and structures. Please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Dr. Mehta.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. Wow, I don't think I can top that or at least match that. So I'm gonna just do my work. I'm gonna share my screen now. Is that okay? Okay, so let me know if you see. Perfect. All right, so you see the slides, right? I'll switch to my notes as well.
Yeah, we see them. Thank you. You're good.
Right. Okay, perfect. So before I jump in, I wanted to make sure that there's a lot of things to unpack here, like Dr. Lopez pointed out, and I'm gonna try and do justice to this overly complicated topic when addressing the roots of colonization and racism in STEM. So to begin, I think it would be fair to first talk about how we understand the term STEM itself. So I was thinking, when we see this word STEM, we think of 4 disciplines linked to each other, yet in some ways separate. The separation is implicit in the 4 separate letters, like science being the study of nature, mathematics more vague to define than science, but perhaps the study of quantity, measurement, space, and even change. Engineering can be considered the application of math and science, a process to create technology, solve problems in the world, and so on. This is the kind of definition and explanation of STEM that we have heard a lot. Even though if you look at the journeys or experiences of scientists and mathematicians, and when we are talking science and mathematicians, we are also explicitly imagining white men. That's just the reality of STEM, although that field is changing a little bit. But even if you look at their journeys, they don't make a distinction between these 4 letters the way it does now. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this construction of STEM is driven by a need to generate labor for a STEM-oriented market, right? We live in a neoliberal system where the educational system, especially the STEM education system, is driven by these market forces, which is why a neat categorization of these disciplines, these fields, is in favor of the market. That is important to bring up because, as you see, when we talk about the discourses in STEM education, you would hear a lot about problem solving and creativity and all sorts of things. Problem solving to do what? Problems, many of which would not have existed without STEM in the first place. No carbon emissions without the technologies that have the power to drill the earth, without automobiles, power plants, industrial revolution, etc. Technological systems that go against nature. That doesn't mean that all technologies go against the force of nature or all science goes against the force of nature. We have examples from our histories way before the terms science or technology or mathematics were coined, that work in tandem with nature, that consider humans as nature. Point being that science, technology, mathematics, engineering are terms that may be relatively recent. Like science was coined in 16th century, but the practices of understanding nature, using engineering as tools and technologies, and even formulating space and numbers have pre-existed modern science. That said, what I really want to focus on is, before we even start considering how we rethink STEM to be more inclusive of Black, Indigenous, and people of color's ways of knowing and being, we need to first understand why we have not done this already. Why is there an absence of Indigenous ways of knowing in STEM disciplines? Unfortunately, the problem lies in the very root of STEM itself and its colonial and racial history. This topic is very contentious, as you may have guessed, because it challenges the core existential underpinning of science as we know it. It makes a lot of scientists and STEM scholars very uncomfortable. in researching for this presentation, I came across some very dismissive and racist reactions from established scholars who cannot fathom the gravity of the situation, to be honest, because it takes us back to the topic of colonization. I also come from a country rooted in colonization, the crown jewel of British Empire, it was called. I grew up in a nation state independent of its colonial oppressors. I learned about our history as a nation that had gained freedom through the efforts of Gandhis and Nehrus and many revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, Subhash Chandra Bose, some names you may have heard, through violent and non-violent means to reclaim their independence. I learned about this glorious history, the fights and the struggles. I learned about the division of this land, the forced migration of my grandparents from what is now Pakistan, from a land that had been our home for thousands of years to land now, India, which was described as our new home to be, right, by the colonizers. Mountbatten gave away India back to Nehru, drawing a line between India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh now, dividing us into pieces. In this new home, the new post-colonial school systems, while recreating and rewriting its history of independence from the British, continued to uncritically co-opt their knowledge systems, which I too, until recently, took for granted as a norm, as neutral, objective tools to understand reality. Through these systems of knowledge, I too believe that the old ways of my people were archaic and unscientific, that modern science, although intertwined with colonizers, was an independent and neutral methodology to study and understand nature, as most of us are taught. These beliefs are so deeply rooted in me, and I use the present tense because I'm well aware of how I still check any new knowledge with the scientific method and its way of knowing. I still catch myself rationalizing my new understanding of nature and the universe through the lens of these universal truths. My years of training in the field of science, engineering, technology make it very difficult for me to unlearn the deeply embedded assumptions about knowledge that I know how to contest in theory, but not yet can figure out how to live with these new understandings. Through this presentation, I'd like to demonstrate how STEM as we know it, in some form or the other, has been at the center of not only perpetuating a knowledge hierarchy that was used to colonize, racialize, and marginalize the peoples beyond Europe, the West, but still continue to maintain a hegemonic hold over people that come of colonized past and presence. Specifically, I use Dr. Linda Tuhevai Smith's work as an example and source of reference, particularly in talking about the different theories of knowledge. The scientific methodology, as we know, it comes from an empiricist and the scientific paradigm of positivism, as we know. What this means is that it defines knowledge or knowledge systems as how the natural world can be examined and understood. That's how you can gain knowledge. Understanding in this paradigm is akin to measuring. Understanding is thus more concerned with procedural problems. How can something be measured instead of whether it is worth measuring, whether we should be measuring, whether measuring is understanding. In this journey, it separates itself from anything that challenges its rules of classification, framing, or practice. Colonizers and researchers, what Edward Said has called the Orientalist view, have used these epistemologies on colonized peoples and lands to categorize people, their lands, ideas, concepts, knowledge, condensing complex images and ways of being into broad classifications, comparing people through models and standardize their existence, and even setting criteria of evaluation, ranking, and ranking and imposing higher and lower orders of thinking and knowing. These are not new to us. These school systems still exist. We are still doing this. Some examples of what this looks like are race and gender. So categories like race were used to reason for superior biology, existence, morality, value, knowledge, right? We have seen that with the Nazis, we have seen that with the colonizers, that the first constructed a concept and then used that concept to present or position a moral superiority, an epistemological superiority over anybody else. Categories like gender, even we used to determine relationship in society between men and women, even dividing society into gendered roles and norms, creating forced binaries and polarities. When if you look at some of the pre-colonial discourses, especially say, for example, in Islamic poetry, you would see such gender fluid writing in Sufism, for instance, that doesn't fit into these categories. But if you look at it from the new colonized norms, you would categorize some of these beautiful poems as from a homosexual lens, for instance. Any critiques of this approach that plays within the rules of the system, for example, Marxism or white feminism, the systems of classification, presentation, and evaluation, that do not challenge the core sets of rules itself, are still considered legitimate points of debate. However, any critiques that question these epistemological hierarchies that set these rules in the first place are completely dismissed. For example, indigenous beliefs about nature and reality were considered shocking, aberrant, barbaric, and even were prime targets for efforts of missionaries who focused on re-education of the savage colonized peoples. So it's not even considered on the same pedestal, let alone be considered as knowledge in the first place. I share this quote by Swami Vivekananda, who wrote this in the context of India, but it's so, if you remove the term, if you remove the name of the author, it applies to any indigenous context. I am not using examples from India, to be very honest, in particular, because it's a more complicated field, right? It's a colonization within colonization of, we never even talk about the actual indigenous people from India, the Adivasis or the Dalits, when we are talking about Indian struggle for independence. I just want to be mindful of that as well. But just the similarity of how the school systems were used to teach the young minds to challenge their own traditions, undermine their traditions and knowledges, and erase that ways of being. It was rooted in educational systems.
Dr. Mehta, your slides are not changing.
Oh, so okay.
It's okay. Just letting you know.
What do you see now?
We see the title.
Oh, wow. Okay. So
yeah. If you want to go, there you go.
Oh, wow. So you thought this whole time I was just looking at the, all right. So I'm going to quickly show you the slides. I was talking about STEM, the examples, indigenous ways of knowing, my own history. Okay. All right. So we talked about this, and the quote from Swami Vivekananda that the child is taken to school, and the first thing he learns is that his father is a fool. The second thing, that the grandfather is a lunatic. The third thing, that his teachers are hypocrites. The fourth thing, that his sacred books are a mass of lies. By the time he reaches 16, he's a mass of negation, lifeless and boneless. Like I said, this example, even though it's from India, it applies to a lot of indigenous contexts as well. Destruction of these, the native art, the native epistemologies is also, it's rooted in these colonial approaches. So I'm going to try and switch back to my notes and let me know if I can switch the slides or not. Right. Do you see the slide chain now?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, thank you. So Theo Goldberg has argued that this epistemological hierarchy, it predates the colonial era as well. So he's argued how the depictions of mythical half-animal people from faraway lands created this, in the eye of the observer, an image overcome by awe, repulsion, and fear that implied a threat to their spirituality and politics. The savagery of these peoples was also internalized as the peoples needing disciplining and denied them their humanity. Missions carried this work accompanying colonizations and saw it their job to educate the savages, to impose the epistemological systems, the knowledge systems from the West. Let's look at an example of how these knowledge systems can vary, right? So on the slide, you should see that the Maori word for space and time are same. I use this example from Tuhevai Smith's book, Wa and Wahi, similar words about space and time, because like many indigenous knowledges, Maori language did not make a distinction between space and time because they were not considered absolute categories. These distinctions are so embedded in our own being and knowing that we can barely wrap our heads around the possibility of a reality where time need not be measured or chunked into categories. This example has racist implications. A common depiction of indigenous peoples living sustainable lives has been being lazy, not organizing their time, wasting time not working, not separating time for work and pleasure, and so on. When many indigenous value and knowledge systems do not see a need to measure time, being as knowing, or sees human as nature, or does not even consider human as separate from nature, uh, these do not fit into the existing scientific method. For example, mind is not a concept in many knowledge systems. But when we bring up issues like these, they are still dismissed as lesser forms of knowledge or just being unscientific. There are colonial implications for measuring space and time, obviously. Measuring space and time had several severe impact of indigenous people's ways of being and knowing. Lands could be measured, categorized, divided into untamed and tamed lands, civilizations and civilized, jungles and cities. Lines could be drawn on maps to separate the civilized from the savages. Indigenous peoples not necessarily saw land as something that could be separate from themselves. Many Adivasis in India too consider land or earth as where they come from and where they would return to. Did not see a need to even mark or categorize.
Dr. Mehta, we're still seeing the codices slide here.
Oh, geez.
It's okay. It's all right. There you go.
How about now? All right, I'm not gonna look at my notes and I'm just gonna remember them. All right. So like I said, so there are colonial implications of measuring space and time because the measurement of space and time itself has been used to categorize and marginalize the indigenous peoples and their knowledge and ways of being. There are implications for STEM as well. How we see nature, how we see the need to measure, to quantify, to compare, to order, organize, rank, they all come out of the scientific method. The modern scientific method, the need to apply to solutions, the need for it to be a utility for knowledge. They come out of these knowledge hierarchies that leave no place for non-Western, non-Eurocentric ways of knowing and being. Even if you bring this up, it would be dismissed as being unscientific, right? So that's the example. It goes back to, if you don't play with the rules, it just doesn't count as knowledge. Indigenous knowledge has no room in existing STEM education systems, honestly, because they challenge the roots of STEM. Even this presentation will be merely dismissed. And I've done that before, gone through this before, but this is the first time I was talking about presenting publicly. So I offer some next steps before I hand over to my colleagues. What would it mean to study nature from a perspective not tied to modern science? Is it even possible? What would it mean to have educational systems that do not measure understanding? Dr. Peter Gray, who's an evolutionary psychologist, talks about play and creativity, and he too strictly opposes the idea of measurement or assessment. It sees no point and says, and I quote, that if you have this urge to measure or assess, just don't tell the child. What would it mean, I ask finally, to decolonize current educational systems? Is it even possible? On that note, I'll stop sharing and hand it back to our host. Thank you.
Okay, I will take over. Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta. That was a fantastic talk. It's going to be hard to follow that up. Meanwhile, as I prepare, please answer the poll of, do your teaching examples reflect the student population you teach? I'll give you maybe about 30 more seconds or so to complete the poll. Okay, so I'm just going to end that, and let's see if I can share the results here. Okay, so here we have the results for this question. It looks pretty evenly distributed between yes and sometimes, and some saying no. And so I appreciate all of your honesty. And I hope that after my presentation, you have some practices you can use so that we can all move towards that yes column. Okay, so please let me know and stop me if you cannot see my slides. So as was mentioned before, I'm Professor Mario Banuelos. I'm an assistant professor of mathematics here at Fresno State. And today I want to talk about anti-racism in mathematics. And I also want to share that I am by no means an expert in this area. My training is as an applied mathematician, but as an applied mathematician, I use data almost every day in my research, in my teaching, and being able to understand where that data comes from, the biases that it has, and the methodologies, and as well as the implications of using those methods is super important. So I will contextualize what I'm talking about in the terms of people that have training in mathematical education and anti-racism. So just as a brief outline, I'm going to talk about notions of success in teaching mathematics. And I think this follows up greatly from the previous presentation where we're talking about measurement. I couldn't have put that in better myself. So we'll talk about notions of success, also historical use of mathematics textbooks as ideological tools, and then define what whiteness, bias, racism, and mathematical models all have in common, and how that interplay works. And I'll end with some anti-racist pedagogy / practices that you can use at an individual level, but hopefully you can push to an institutional level as well. Okay, so what does success mean in your practice? This is a guiding question that has me reflecting almost every day this semester, and how it affects my teaching as well. So the question I asked was, do your teaching examples reflect the student population you teach? And the reason I ask is because how you measure success in your practice is going to influence how you both learn and teach math. So this is a quote from Professor Gutierrez, who is one of my math education heroes. And because what constitutes success in a large discussion is this achievement or proficiency on standardized exams, or some tangible outcomes. And so by and large, that's how we're taught success in mathematics is. And so I want to challenge that perception and really get into, if you think of success as having my students represented in the problems I'm talking about, and right, that's a different layer of success in teaching and learning mathematics. To kind of quantify what I mean by math, it's the study of pattern, structure, space, and change. I was mentioned before, and it's oftentimes with symbols. So how do we redefine success? So one of the ways we can do this is taking a post-structural view of success. So let's reframe ideas of what proficiency means. Let's reframe ideas of what success or achievement gap means, to include this idea of self-actualization, right? So this idea that we can become better people by our own definitions and not necessarily by the definitions provided by a school or a system. So another way we can do this is from Joe Bowler, this mathematical mindset. So if you've heard of the growth mindset, this book is Mathematical Mindset, which takes it in a little bit more specific to mathematics and emphasizing growth versus this idea that there's math people. Whenever I tell people that I teach mathematics, I always get either like this visceral response to that. And I don't know why that is. People don't usually do that with other subjects. So part of it is just deprogramming this idea that there are math people. And I do that in my classes by starting off with a Bob Ross video. And I say, I play like 30 seconds of it and I say, okay, now you can paint like him. And that's not true, right? So the truth is that math and painting and everything takes practice. This image here is just like if we're talking about finding X, this could be a measure of success, right? We're just gonna locate where it is. So embedding diverse perspectives in mathematical texts to move beyond whiteness in math education is another way to redefine what you think success is. And so when we're talking about disrupting teacher education programs, right, if most of this time it's success means high scores on an exam, really we need to make sure that the texts that we use represent diverse perspectives. So this is a quote by Marcel Haddix, and we really want to see ourselves, but the students should also see themselves in the mathematical texts that we use. Okay, so when we're talking about whiteness in math education, I just want to clarify that what this means and how it's different from white privilege. So, and I couldn't have said it better than Dan Beatty and Luis Leiva. White privilege refers to the benefits from racism in favor of whites, and white supremacy is the systematic maintenance of that. So we're going to tackle this a little bit in terms of what does this look like historically? What does it look like now? And as well as how do you identify those in different levels in math education? Okay, so historically, I think an extreme example, but an example I think that should be discussed is 1940s Nazi Germany. And so this image here is an example of using mathematics to drive a political ideology and a racist ideology. And so to the best of my translation here, this is asking, what is the cost of taking care of people who have inherited diseases? And so this first one is this hospital, the schooling, and then some more hospital time. But really the key takeaway is they've equated taking care of an individual to the income of people that were not affected with the disease, right? And so even though this is a kind of extreme example, it's an example that was used. And from this extremeness, there is this still, I think, a common narrative that textbooks usually take a Eurocentric view of mathematics. And mathematics and science communities, I've come across a lot of my fellow peers in math that they don't feel welcome, right? So that's something that still happens today. And then current machine learning and mathematical models, which is where I specialize in. So how do we understand whiteness in mathematics education? So there's really three parts, and this is pulling from Beatty's work. And the first part is ideological. So, I mean, institutional. So institutional is this first framework of understanding whiteness in math education. And these include the following parts. So there's ideological discourses. So that is this racial hierarchy of mathematics ability, that belief, or the belief that there's an innate math ability versus the idea that people can become better at math by practicing it. And then this other ideological discourse of having math as neutral. So I don't believe mathematics is neutral because it is presented, it is disseminated in the context of things that are not neutral. So it cannot be neutral. The second one is physical space. So what does the physical space look like? What did the school messages say? Are students represented in are they represented in like advertisements and things like that of schools, right? How are they visible? Are students that are marginalized visible, or are they not? History. So this is acknowledging patterns of exclusion or inclusion, or having certain curricular perspectives. And this ties back to the textbook example. And so Beatty also used math education and the courses students took as an example of, let's view that as property. And it led to this conclusion that this relates to racial inequity. So that's the institutional way to kind of observe and frame whiteness in math education. The second is labor. So this subdivides into cognition, emotion, and behavior. So in cognition, I think there's a lot of research that suggests that Black and Latinx students often lack this opportunity to engage in cognitive depth because it's do this worksheet and then report back what your answers are. And then there's also this idea of stereotype that we have to deal with. The second is this idea of emotion and having this range of emotional experiences that is allowed. So group work affects how students of color perform if there's implicit and explicit biases in other group members. And then the last one here is behavior, and that's language norms. And really, what are the expectations kind of put on before of what are the language norms in mathematics and how do we change that? And then the last framework here is identity. So this academic delegitimization refers to mathematics identities and using deficit perspectives of students of color and their ability. So I want to share an example that I think really drives this point home. A lot of people in the math community, one of the things that came up when we shifted to virtual teaching was how do we stop students from cheating on exams? And this really bothered me on a fundamental level because really we shouldn't be worried about students cheating on exams. We should explain, it's about the honor system and all this, but really we should be creating assessments that don't necessarily just work on something that could be Googleable, right? That's not an effective way to measure student learning. So the other part is co-construction of meaning. This is back from Martin in 2009. And this is in reference to peer perceptions of each other. So if my peer feels like I'm only here because I'm brown and not because of my hard work, then that is an example of how whiteness can still peer into this identity aspect. And then the last one here is agency and resistance. So both invisible and hyper visible. Oftentimes when there's students of color in programs, especially like in graduate programs, I feel it's easy to feel invisible because there's nobody there, or it's very few people there that are from a similar background. But at the same time, you may fear being tokenized. And so how do you navigate this world? A lot of the time that's unfortunately has to be with code switching. Okay, so this last idea of math often reinforces biases and racism. So with the rise of data, it's really these machine learning and predictive algorithms, it's really hard to kind of escape and be off the grid. But there are plenty of examples where these methods and mathematics can be used to reinforce biases and racist policies. So these are some examples, and I hope this presentation gets shared so you can just click on these. So recommendation systems, the identifying of gender from some of these larger corporations. This gender shades, if you just look up gender shades, that is a wonderful study about how this Black woman, she tried to have her face recognized by one of these facial recognition systems, and it didn't recognize her face. And then she put a white mask on, and it did. And so that sparked a research study that really kind of put the onus back on these companies and said, you know, your data is not representative of the population. Your data is not going to accurately identify people because it's biased. Also, especially in the math community, this idea of predictive policing, and I've also linked one where the ICE detention, how they'd use some risk analysis to determine whether people are detained or not, right? So these data and these algorithms are very much a part of our everyday lives. And I think communicating that with students at all levels is super important. So here are 4 ways I believe that as individuals and institutions, we can counter the narrative. So first is to transform physical space to build community. I don't really necessarily like using the word inclusive anymore. That was actually because I attended one of these webinars myself, and it said, and they asked, when we say the word inclusive or including, what are we including students into, right? So I prefer the term community. The second is to include diverse perspectives and culturally relevant ideologies in your math examples and texts. And the third is to include an interpret and contextualize component in your math curriculum. I think oftentimes, and I see this in many parts of mathematics, let's apply this method of like a t-test or a linear regression, and then that's the end of the story without really contextualizing what does that mean? What does my conclusion mean to the data and to the people I'm applying these methods to? And lastly is discuss how current mathematical models define success and their effects on marginalized communities. I think discussing them in the context of the world we live in now with students is super important. So I'll leave you with this idea that creation and dissemination of math is not void of institutional racism or the societal norms it comes from. When we learn and teach math, we have to consciously combat these narratives and redefine what success in math means. So Uncle Tony from Heavyweights defines success as everybody losing weight. So I challenge you to redefine what success means for you. I'll leave you with some suggested readings here, as well as organizations, because I am a strong believer that these organizations help build community and help address a lot of these issues very well. So with that, I'll transition, and I want to thank you all for your time.
You can share your screen as well, Dr. Juarez.
Thank you, Patricia. Let me see here. Is it visible there?
Perfect,
Okay.
yeah.
Just allow some time to answer the poll. And I want to thank Dr. Mehta and Dr. Banuelos. That was, it was great stuff. Really enjoyed listening to you. And Dr. Lopez, let me know when I should get started.
Yeah, I think that the survey, the poll
Okay.
is done, so. All right, they're sharing the poll now. Go ahead and start.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So part of why I asked that question about the term reflexivity or self-reflexivity, it's a term that we use a lot in academia and that we use as a concept in critical scholarship about our positionality. And one of the things that I'm arguing, right, is this reimagining this idea of self-reflexivity to help with anti-racist pedagogy. See here, can I? Oh, here we go. Because one of the questions that I asked is like, what is the goal of anti-racism? And I know I heard Dr. Banuelos talk about the term inclusiveness, and it's I asked this question, what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to do in these institutions, right? What we're trying to do in terms of construction of knowledge, and the goal of anti-racism, I mean, for me is pretty simple, right? That ultimately we're trying to create structures that value knowledge and intelligence plurally, right? That there's many forms of knowledge, there's many forms of intelligence, and for those reasons, we want to create inclusive spaces, right? Inclusive classrooms, inclusive structures that we want to stops from systematically perpetuating narrow concepts of intelligence and knowledge. Right? We don't want to continue that, right? That's the ultimate goal as facilitators of knowledge, that we can't see ourselves continuing to do that, right? That because that not only limits, as Dr. Mehta and Dr. Banuelos saying, it limits whole disciplines. I mean, it's something that we're in communication studies we're struggling with, that like it can limit how knowledge moves forward, right, when it's so narrow. And so I see the project as more than just social justice, right, and inclusion. Although it's still really important, the idea is that we get to academic excellence, right, that we actually get to be able to push forward these views of knowledge, intelligence, in more full ways, right? And for me, it's a great opportunity that I see there that there's a lot of opportunity, because we've only understood the world in very narrow views, right? And so part of what I struggle with sometimes is that I identify as a Latino, I identify as Chicano, and I feel like I get pigeonholed as that, right, is a Latino scholar or a Chicano scholar. But like, one of the things that I want to point out too is that first and foremost, we're scholars that are curious about the world around us. We are scholars, point blank. Like, that's it. And we're scholars. We want to know about the world and how it works. And so I see that as some of the goals. And why self-reflexivity? Why this concept? Well, it's a widely understood concept. To me, it exemplifies this idea of disembodied theorizing, right? This colonial theorizing, right? And the way we understand it now, it doesn't provide the intended results, right? And I'll get to the definition, right? Defining this idea of reflexivity. And basically, you can read the definitions there by L. Davies. But like, it's focusing on ourselves and our positionality in the world. And that's good. That's not like, right. That's important, right? Because when you do that, you're actually acknowledging that the world is socially constructed, right? Because there's a lot of people that still don't want to believe that the world is socially constructed. And if you believe that the world is socially constructed, and there are hierarchies, right? The world is embedded with power. And in this socially constructed world, there's some things that are valued more than others, and some bodies that are valued more than others, and their ways of understanding the world are valued more than others. But that's limited, right? That's just doing that is limited. And Emmer Breyer and Desmond, in their book on reflexivity and race, talk about or critique that, right? That the vast majority of thinkers typically understood as reflexivity has been on the exercise of recognizing how aspects of one's identity or social location can affect one's vision of the social world. And that view is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And why isn't it sufficient? It's disembodied theorizing. Like, what does it mean theorize, right? And this is all like theory. We're talking about ontology and epistemology. What happens when we return those things to the body? That's something that Dr. Mehta was getting to in terms of not valuing indigenous epistemologies. And so I want to reimagine this term self-reflexivity through bodies as a skill that can be developed and through our engagement with the world around us, right? That we see the world and understand the world through our senses, through our bodies, and in collaboration or in community with one another. And so this embodied self-reflexivity, right? It's this idea of what Anzaldúa calls consciousness building. Gloria Anzaldúa, Chicana feminist scholar, which influences a lot of what my views on communication studies and the way we view communication. That our world is also socially constructed, reflective of power. It's a process of accounting for positionality and truly understanding what reflexivity means, not just an understanding, a definition. What I'm getting with that is that, like, we don't just understand the world because we read a definition of it, right? It's not just text. Like, you have to feel the world. You have to understand what it means what's a good example? Like when you go to college and you find out about democracy and you get this feeling inside of you, right? When you, whether it's positive or negative, but like there is a what's the word I'm looking for? There's a physical reaction, right? There's a visceral reaction that we have when we come to knowledge. Sometimes it bums us out. Sometimes it can feel empowering, but it's more than just understanding words on a text. And so. Sorry, lost my place there. Oh, yeah, sorry. I messed up my numbers there. So it's this idea of self-reflexivity has to be understood in collaboration, right? The world is socially constructed. We understand the world. And so what it means to understand our positionality, right? Like it's not just enough sexual, Latino, Chicano, male, right? But materially, I understand what that means in the world, and there's times where that can be shocking, right? Like, that can be difficult. And so, an example that I use, and I'm gonna get to well, I'm gonna jump to my example, but there's two parts of this, right? There's going through the process of understanding self-reflexivity in the classroom, right? You can read the definition, but actually practicing self-reflexivity, you have to experience it. You have to go through it. And this is where it's influenced by Gloria Anzaldúa's understandings of how we process knowledge, right? We embody and we process knowledge. And in the classroom, right, we when we put these ideas into practice, there's things that we learn about it. There's things that we learn about what does it mean to be anti-racist in the classroom, right? And you won't know what that really means until you go through it, right? Until you experience it. Not only that, but this idea of returning back to this idea of disembodied theorizing, we have to also understand what those bodies that come into the classroom, their prior knowledge, right? Acknowledge that they have prior knowledge, assume that they have prior knowledge, that communities already have knowledge, even if they're not recognized by our current educational systems, right? And so there's a couple levels there to understanding this idea of embodying self-reflexivity. So one of the arguments that I make in terms of what I'm saying about self-reflexivity, the term itself, right, or the concept itself, is that communities of color are disciplined to be reflexive, right? That they already come with knowledge into the classroom. And I argue this is an example of cultural capital related to Yoso's community cultural wealth. And what I'm saying there is that if the world is socially constructed, if we understand the world in community with one another, that there are hierarchies, that for some people there's power exercised over them. They have to be mindful of their communication already, and so they come into the classroom already having knowledge about, reflecting on how they communicate with other people, right? Like one of the examples that I use when I talk about reflexivity and being disciplined, or reflexivity being disciplined to my body, was I grew up in Santa Barbara, California. Santa Barbara, California, for, I want to say, past 40, 50 plus years, has been a largely Latino, Hispanic, primarily Mexican American community, right? It's like half Latino, half white community. And I grew up in my parents were migrants from Mexico in the 80s. My dad worked for as a gardener, and I remember one time when he was charging someone, they were trying to rip him off. Right, this white homeowner was trying to lowball my dad, and I got really upset. I was like, we were talking in Spanish, and I was like, por qué te estás dejando? And his response was like, don't say anything, right? Don't cause any trouble. Don't don't mess this up, because we need the money, right? And that's an example of this idea of reflexivity and how it's disciplined into bodies, and which is not captured by that standard definition, right? Which is not understood, because it's something that you have to experience. And not everybody experiences that, right? There's privileged bodies that don't experience that type of social disciplining. And so when looking at this concept, this meta-analysis of this term, this concept of self-reflexivity, one is that we have to reshape or reimagine the concept itself. But then also, when we do reimagine this concept itself as a process, really understanding what it means to go through the process of self-reflexivity, right? Really understanding what it means to account for our positionality and how that impacts our communication with those around us. And this is where I get to my example, right? I am a director of graduate students, and we developed a curriculum for teaching public speaking. And if I am true about accounting for my social position and what I teach in the classroom, I have to account for how I teach concepts, right? And so in teaching public speaking, one of the things that we address is voice, right? One of the things that we address is voice. And part of what has allowed me the success in academia is my ability to pass as white and to perform aesthetically as white, right? Like the way that I speak, the way that I hold myself, the way that I perform, my aesthetics give me a lot of passes, all right? And that's not to get in, and that's not even to get into colorism in the Mexican community, right? Like my family calls me güero, and like I get treated completely different than some of my darker cousins. And so there's that part of it, but oh man, I go on these tangents. Sorry, but accounting for my social position and what I'm getting to is that this idea of voice, right, and how we teach it, and how this concept is taught from my body, right? Because it's easy for me to teach about voice and tell people, be assertive, be a leader, talk this way, right? Because I've been disciplined socially disciplined to speak in that way. Even the way I'm doing this presentation now, right? Like my voice carries and performs differently than other people's voices, and that's a problem, right? Because when I'm teaching voice to people of different genders, what does that mean, right? To be honestly, what does that mean, and how am I going to tell someone from my position, tell someone who identifies as a woman, as female, to perform that way, right? Like, oh, you're not doing it right. You have to perform this way, X way. And if I'm going to be self-reflexive, I have to rethink about how I teach that idea, that concept of voice in the classroom, right? The way I introduce the concept, the examples that I use, the choice of book. I mean, we make a lot of choices in the classroom, and that's really important to recognize. And with that, right, like it's important to acknowledge that those differences of gender and how they hold a lot of power. And what I mean by how they hold a lot of power is that when you look at my body, look at my face, and I rarely have ever felt any fear in terms of how I express my voice, right? And one specific context is like asking someone out on a date, right? Like if I ask someone out on a date, I don't have any fear of violence toward my body, right? But that's not exactly true in the world that we live in today, right? If a woman tells directly someone who identifies as a male, no, that can be a cause of violence, right? And I may not understand that fully, but it can be a source of violence for a lot of people in our world today. And so, how do I tell someone to use a more assertive voice, right? When I don't hold that positionality, when I don't have any fear of those consequences for using an assertive voice, and not to minimize that, but there's knowledge of what I'm getting to is that there's knowledge of the world, and the people have been using their voice in a very specific way to avoid violence, right? To avoid something that can bring them harm. And to me, that's not what's the word? Gramsci's term. Gramsci's term of Antonio Gramsci. I don't know why I remember the scholar and I don't remember the name. Anyways, so what I'm getting to is really practicing this idea of self-reflexivity, right? And what it means. And I do see a lot of potential for anti-racism, right? For value for developing inclusive classroom spaces, asking practitioners, and positioning ourselves as facilitators of knowledge to monitor or adapt our communication strategies in the classroom, right? And the goal is to develop classroom spaces, not for the sake of altruism, which is still very important, right? Anti-racism, we're at a point where we're not getting to self-actualizing these systems of knowledge, that we're at a point where we're still asking for permission to be included, or not even asking for permission. That's not a good way to put it. But that we can't fully actualize mathematics, we can't fully actualize science because there's still very narrow views. I mean, communication studies, and I'll stick to my discipline. We can't fully actualize communication studies because there's still very narrow views of what communication studies is and how it's practiced and how it's researched. And so to me, it's developing these classroom spaces. It's still really important, but I want to get to the point where we can get to academic excellence, right? Where I can fully explore communication concepts for academic excellence rather than just for not just for inclusion. Anti-racism is an important project that will lead to academic excellence. And in order to meet that goal of building systems that value plurality and intelligence, we must be inclusive. We must be able to practice these ideas of self-reflexivity, but concept of self-reflexivity is theorized from the body can be an effective tool for anti-racist pedagogy, anti-X pedagogy. And it's valuable for the future of education, specifically for my discipline of communication studies, where we get to more fuller understandings of knowledge and how the world works, rather than these limited views. I went over my time.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and I invite all of our attendees, if you would please go ahead and ask your questions in the chat, and we will moderate those questions to our panelists. And then if you are on Facebook Live, we'll do our best to relay those questions to our panelists as well. And again, if you are on Twitter, please use the Insomniamos PLC hashtag, and you can tweet FS Insomniamos as well. So I think we'll start off with a question that was in the chat. It was addressed to Dr. Mehta, but I think we could address it to all of the panelists today. So the question is, why are Indigenous ways of knowing absent from STEM? How do we check our own participation in reiterating disciplinary knowledge hierarchies? And panelists, I included that in the chat to you all, so you could read it as well.
So I can jump in. So the answer to that question works in many layers. First, of course, goes back to the presentation of which you saw like 3 slides. I was talking about how this goes back not only to the colonial era, which still goes on, but at peak of the colonial era, how not only indigenous ways of knowing were erased, but even before that, how it's deeply rooted in this idea of the other, or the knowledge of the other having no value whatsoever because it doesn't align with the value systems of the West. It's rooted in Greek philosophy. Uh, the very people that you'd see being cited heavily, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, 2 out of those 3 folks made a pretty good case for slavery. I'll let you search who those 2 are. It's a deeply rooted issue when it comes to because science and research have been used as these tools to organize, categorize, and control these peoples, right? So if you start to value their knowledge systems as well, that would be to challenge your own value system, right? And how can that happen? The second part of that problem is, which has always been an issue, but we don't really talk about it when we talk about colonialism, is capitalism. One of the forces that was driving colonialism was this idea to get the prosperity and get the wealth towards Europe, because the center of wealth was in Asia at the time, or actually between Asia and Africa, because a lot of trading was going on there. So in that move, and that still goes on, that capitalistic drive still goes on. And you can see that in our current neoliberal systems as well. If we try and incorporate some of those indigenous ways of knowing in our current STEM education, it does not serve the market, right? Because the market is driven by these computer science coding jobs, these high-tech companies, the Silicon Valley. How does the indigenous knowledge serve that? Because it does not. It has no room in the educational system as we know it. So I can keep going on, but I think those are 2 main aspects that I wanted to highlight.
So another question that we have is that women in general are marginalized and deterred from STEM fields due to dominant gendered ideologies, and a few of you spoke to this. What thoughts, suggestions do you have to ensure that teachers don't perpetuate this in their teaching?
I can start this conversation. I think having examples of people in STEM is super important to like share. These are people's stories. I think too many times people are said that teachers say you can do this and this with like a STEM degree or math degree, and a lot of the times that's where it stops, and we just stop with this idealization of, if someone says scientist, what does my mind go to? Versus these are actual examples of people who are scientists and their stories. Like I think that's not emphasized enough. So one of the things that I do, for example, in my office, is that I have these posters of Black mathematicians, of Latinos and Chicanos and Latinx mathematicians, and trying to just show people that they can also be scientists, right? So like I think it's similar to like, if you don't see yourself in the role that you're promoting, then it's gonna be hard to wanting to continue to be in that field. That's one suggestion.
If I could add to that, and I'm sorry, I'm further complicating this, but if you think, so if you think about the lack of representation, especially women of color, particularly, we not even, when we talk about representation in STEM fields, we usually just stuck with women in particular, and we can't even move forward to talk about even further marginalized communities, because that in itself has been such a big problem to solve, right? People who, women of color who have been successful in entering STEM fields have been the one who have learned the rules of these white men dominating the STEM fields, right? If you learn their rules to play the game, then it's okay for you to come into the door. Even then, you are not welcomed, in the sense that if you look at like some of the research from belongingness in STEM communities, you're constantly reminded that you are an outsider, right? You're constantly reminded that you are here because of some affirmative action or some special reservation system for you. It's not about your own intellectual capabilities or merit, but it's about the system that is trying to balance the equation. There's a lot of different discourses around how people have still continued to marginalize women of color and women in STEM areas, let alone whether you want to bring in your own ways of knowing of STEM into STEM fields. That is just unimaginable at this point, right? So it further complicates the narrative. So the first one is a problem as we stand. The second is just an unimagined reality in like a distant future.
Thank you. Our next question is related to the CBEST, but we can also talk about this in terms of standardized testing. This person was wondering about the basic skills requirements of the CBEST, but we can also think of this as other standardized tests. How do these act as a barrier to some students who would like to become teachers? And what do we know about this exam, but again, any other standardized assessments, and any attempt to ensure that they aren't racially biased? So whichever of you would like to maybe address that or talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I want, so I'll start, but I think we're not going to say it's not racially biased, right? I just looked up the passing rates, first time passing rates by gender and ethnicity. 80.9% of white people pass on their first time, all three sections. And then if we look at like Latinos, Latinx, 53.7%. Okay, I don't have to do a statistical test. Let me just tell you that that's a big difference. And then like African American, 47.3%. So it is disproportionately like excluding people of color, right? And also people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I don't know, get rid of it. That's going to be my solution. Rohit, do you have any other solutions?
My solutions are not going to be immediately helpful, because I'm talking quite big and decolonial ideas. I mentioned a little bit in my talk, the whole idea of standardizing in the first place, the whole idea of trying to measure knowledge. It's just it's so bizarre. And I'm not saying that I always knew about this. I'm also learning and challenging and being self-reflexive. And I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that this standardized and measurement and assessment based system really only serves the market. It's quite obvious. You look at the word that like Chomsky has been talking about this like since forever. But it only serves the market's need. It only serves the market's need because they need a new form of labor that can do the exact type of job that they want. They do not want creative folks. Creativity is only limited for people higher up, right? You do not want any creativity. No wonder there is no room for creativity in the school systems, right? It's quite saddening that that's where we are. Honestly, we don't need any of this. But what would that mean? People, the first question people are going to ask is like, how do we have a sense of accountability? How do we really know that people know what they know? How do we really know that people are actually working or doing their part of the job? And I would ask, like, why does that really matter? Why does it matter that you want to measure the exact amount of how much somebody knows? When we know very well that people are always becoming, we are always learning, always changing, you're such dynamic beings, that it just makes no sense to try and capture us in numbers. And again, I know that this is like really disruptive for a lot of folks, so I apologize, but I've also tried to learn and change my mind about this, and I'm still working. So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
So another question that we have is, what does a utopian STEM education look like to you?
Who wants to jump in? I feel like I'm hogging this conversation. I don't want to do that.
Oh, what about if we frame it? What does the utopian education system look like? And then Sergio can weigh in.
I mean, yeah, a utopian educational system, and I've been trying to imagine what that looks like, because there are these conversations about the tensions between trying to change systems that are working the way they're supposed to be working, right? Like going back to that previous question about the CBEST, it's working how it's supposed to be working. That's an unfortunate truth, is that it's working the way it's supposed to be working, and how do we reimagine these educational systems in ways that were meant for our bodies and for our understandings of the world? And I think um, I think there's possibilities in now, right? I think there's possibilities now to leverage technology, to leverage um, this ability to not be tied to brick and mortar buildings to facilitate knowledge. But the thing is, we have to build it, right? We have to. They're not going to build these systems are not going to build themselves. But I think there's opportunities there to practice knowledge construction in those very areas where we see that have been identified or have been labeled as less than, right? Like in those areas that have been labeled as where there is a lack of knowledge or a lack of X, where we can actually work in those areas and work in those places, not tied to these brick and mortar structures. And I believe in it. I truly believe that, because it's and this is where at times where it's difficult to what's the word I'm looking for, to disrupt capitalism by at times partaking in capitalism, right? We're working from the inside of capitalism to try to disrupt it, because these brick and mortar structures cost a lot of money, right? They are cumbersome for the most part. Even a university, like most universities, are what's the word I'm looking for? Conservative, not in the well, kind of in the political sense, but like in that they move slow. They don't adopt ideas really quick, and like things are moving fast now, and things can move really quickly, and that can change. And so there's ways that we can build the structures that we want to build that are meant for us. But there's going to have to be folks that take that risk at some point.
Yeah, I'll add on to that by some examples. I think that I try to implement that I think have been so far this semester pretty successful, and that's I got rid of all my exams, and I'm doing either presentations or some other kind of group project. And I want students to leave my class with more skills than they came in. So that's part of it. Like I want them to have skills that they can use to operate in the world after they graduate. The other part is, and I hadn't mentioned this before, but I'm the Open Education Resources Faculty Fellow at Fresno State as well. And so a step I take is just having all my courses be zero cost, right? If I'm using open education resources, that's even better, but at least if having them be zero cost, I think that is a step in the direction that we want to take. We had just a panel of students yesterday at Fresno State sharing their experiences of how the cost of textbooks affects the classes they take. And sometimes there are no other options but to take those sections of classes, and they have to take those and they have to pay for the books.
And so good. Thank you, Sergio and Mario, for sharing that. I'm glad you did, because I was going on a very different note, and I don't think there is anything like an utopian system, right? So what we're trying to do really is make a shift towards a better system. So I do something similar to what Mario does in my courses. I don't have any deadlines. I don't have any exams. I give my students some context for a realistic problem that they could face as educators. And then most of our learning happens and they create something, I give them feedback on it, right? If there is room for like some tweaking, some changing, some revising, we do a back and forth, right? I tell them upfront that the grades, they are there, the numbers are there because I have to show it to other people, but I don't really care about them. I don't want you to care about them. As long as you do the tasks, you check those boxes, you're going to get those numbers, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. Our focus is going to be the exchange between us. All my especially since moving to online, all coursework is asynchronous completely, so that they can work whenever they want. Obviously that raises questions about a sense of community, sense of belonging, right? Making sure that they have some connections going on. So I made the group work. Now that raises new questions. I don't want to work with this person. I worked with them last semester and they are not really blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's going to happen in real life too, right? So figure it out yourself. If you want to just meet asynchronously, that's fine too, right? So that kind of flexibility, that kind of conscious challenging of ideas like accountability, efficiency, these all come from this neoliberal capitalist system, right? That you have to do something in a given period of time for it to be considered valuable, right? That you have to be enough productive in a given week, in a given month, in a given year. All of those ideas are made up constructs, if you think about it, right? There's no real way of measuring a person's worth or success divided by time. Those are also are byproducts of this capitalist colonial system that we are all immersed in.
That's a really good segue into the next question that we have. And this came through the chat a little while ago, so I'll type it in for our panelists as well. But how do you see the role of anti-racist pedagogy in academia, or I guess in K-12, and its impact on a capitalist society? How do those two things work together?
Again, I feel like I'm hogging this. I also missed part of the question because my dog was really barking loud in my ear. So could you repeat that, please, Maria? Oh,
sure. Yeah, I just put it in there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, what's it?
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because they're clearly intertwined, right? Because as long as you play by the rules of this capitalist society, you would find more and more people from historically marginalized background being quote unquote represented in the system. And I will take a different example. You look at pop culture. You would see a lot of movies coming out that have more representation, right? That's not because suddenly people got really woke. That's because capitalistic studios see space for making money there, right? Because they see people of color have money to go watch these movies, to consume that content. So you'd see more and more of that. If tomorrow, for some reason, I'm going to rephrase. If tomorrow, for some reason, people of color decide that they won't watch any movies again, you would see that this representative media would slowly start to go away as well. So what I'm trying to say is that these things are so intertwined that I don't think anti-racism has that much power at the moment that it can change the capitalist system. We can make a little bit of dent here and there, but maybe I'm being a little too pessimistic, right? So I'm gonna stop talking.
No, I agree with what Dr. Mehta is saying, because if we live in a socially constructed world, then there's a trajectory that the world is moving in, whether we like it or not, right? And we can impact the trajectory of that system in some ways, right? And anti-racist pedagogies having an impact on a capitalist society, like it can have some impact. It definitely can have some impact. And one way that I see that is um, uh, like this idea of our degrees as a Gucci bag, right? Like that our degrees are some form of representation of self-worth, and you see this in the ranking systems of schools, right? Like schools are ranked in the, what is it, U.S. World News or whatnot. But what I see the possibilities of these anti-racist pedagogies is that we can disturb some of that. We can have an impact on what occurs in our classrooms, what knowledge is valued, so that we create students who are more mindful of those values, right? Those values of placing the material values on education, and the possibility of creating different systems, creating systems that disrupt that. And we do that. I mean, the OER, for example, as Dr. Banuelos was saying, right? Like that's a direct example of disrupting some of those textbooks and the system of textbooks, and the system of journals, right? We pay for access to those journals as institutions, and like when something is available OER, then they're not making that money, right? If we publish something that is available as open for students, then it disrupts some of that. And so I do see a lot of possibilities with anti-racism on disrupting our capitalist society. We're not going to stop the capitalist society. I mean, that's the really big social endeavor. I agree with Dr. Mehta with that. We can impact in some ways and change the trajectory.
I'll add just one thought is to continue on Dr. Juarez's and Dr. Mehta's thoughts is I also don't think it will change it overnight or in our lifetime, but I imagine hopefully a world where students view the world as less transactional. So I feel like we do that a lot in our daily lives. So if I could influence students to view the world as less transactional, I think that's a win. And doing that in mathematics, in conversations you have with people, in relationships.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Banuelos, because it sparked something that one of the questions that I've asked my colleagues and that we've had a fundamental discussion on is like, what is the project of teaching? Because one of the ways that I see is this idea of climbing the social ladder, right? That we are teaching students to be more professional, to climb the social ladder. And if that's the project, then we're always going to see these marginalized communities as less than, right? They're always going to be viewed as less than if that is the project that in fact we're being a part of. And I've had arguments with colleagues about this, like that can't be the project, right? If we keep seeing it as professionalizing students, being able to provide a degree so that they can get better jobs only, right? Like it is helpful and it is important, but it's not the only thing. And if we keep framing education as to serve those purposes, then we're failing. Upward social. If the goal is upward social mobility, then we're going to fail a lot of communities because it excludes. It's very exclusionary.
So you all spoke very powerfully about the contributions of people of color and indigenous communities to your respective fields. How can K through 12 teachers integrate, right, the information, the contributions, right, of these communities, POC and Indigenous, in their curriculum and advocate for teaching this material, where we know that many of our teachers are in districts that have scripted curricula, particularly in the STEM areas, and may operate from a ideology that STEM is a race neutral, right, field or content area.
I think this is a pretty heavy question. All these questions are pretty heavy, but I would say you can include, for example, like Mayan mathematics in K through 12, right? That's something you can include. That's something I didn't learn about till college. Like this idea of who invented the zero, and the idea that the Mayan civilization also independently invented a zero, right? They're discovered, however you want to view that. It's a different conversation. But yeah, including those examples, I think is super important, because if you don't, right, the Mayans had a base 20 system, right? Why do we use base 10, right? Why don't we ever have this conversation in elementary school or in high school? Like, why do it's a disservice to the students to not talk about this, right? And to talk about different, why do we call things Pythagorean triples, right? Was it Pythagoras the only person that discovered this, right? So answer is no. So why don't we have these conversations? So having these conversations is super important, and it's going to help us move away from having this view of, like, for example, mathematics as just a Eurocentric thing, or right, just one kind of thing, instead of all the communities that contribute to mathematics.
I think Dr. Banuelos speaks to something really important about what you integrate into your syllabus or your lesson plan, right? The concepts that you integrate, the choices that you make. I look at this from a communication perspective, and there's been a big push to integrate, for me, like Chicana queer feminist scholars, being purposeful about like I said, coming from a communication perspective, Gloria Saldúa speaks about language and identity, and that's something that we can be purposeful of integrating scholars into our curriculum, right? Into our readings that look like the students, that have similar identities to the students, and that's one way of being able to integrate indigenous thoughts, and it's important to sometimes we do have to do some work in history. Like, I get frustrated with some of my colleagues when it comes to talking about governance and U.S. history, because our democracy was influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy, right? And that is rarely talked about. That is rarely understood about. There's this assumption that democracy came from nowhere or was invented by the French when they had monarchies. It didn't necessarily come from those places. There's actual historical documented evidence about how indigenous communities have influenced our world today, and it's important to be able to go back and integrate some of that, and I'm talking specifically from communication studies, in terms of how we talk about governance, and how we talk about, and a lot of it is how we talk about stuff because it's communication studies, but it is important that we're able to do some of that work, and integrate integrate scholarship that is more representative of our students.
Dr. Mehta, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, the example that Dr. Banuelos and Dr. Juarez shared, I completely agree with them. The inclusion of authors and scholars and stories of mathematicians and scientists that challenge the status quo, that in itself is going to shift the way students think about scientists and mathematicians and technologists, right? So finding examples of women of color mathematicians, finding examples from, say, the Dr. Banuelos used the Mayan history, right? So those examples, did they just including them in the discussions, that challenges and shakes up the existing worldview that we see everywhere else, right? So I completely just want to resonate that.
So kind of stemming from that, how would you address someone, including teachers, who say that education and the act of teaching is not political right now?
I can take that one first. Not only teaching is political, everything is political. Again, that's a beautiful trick to make people believe that it is not, because then you don't challenge, right? Then you just go by the system, then you just obey, right? I would say the best way, not the best way, perhaps a way to kind of be more conscious, more aware of these systems, is to always ask, what is the status quo? Who does it work for? And if we try to change it, who's going to resist it, right? That would reveal the systemic structures to you pretty much better than anything else I can think of.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, communication is always embedded with value, right? Like when we communicate with people, and or the language that we use, the structures that we build, texts, they are filled with people's ideologies, always, right? They're never neutral, right? And so therefore, to me, the project of education itself and the structures that we're participating in are never neutral. And so if we're not purposely anti-racist, and as Dr. Mehta was pointing to, we're operating from a certain position where we are actually perpetuating exclusionary practices, right? And it's important that we actually be mindful and position ourselves as being engaged in anti-racism, in anti-homophobia, in anti-X, right? That we be purposeful about that, because if not, then we're perpetuating the status quo. And one of my colleagues, scholar named Benny Lemaster, who studies on trans scholars, transgender and communication studies, the question is not whether we're racist or not, right? That's not an effective question. The question is how are we contributing to racism? Because we're all subjects of these systems. These systems do have an impact on our bodies and how we communicate. And if we're not mindful of that, right? If we're not overly vigilant of that, then we're going to perpetuate that without even trying, right? Without even considering it, like as Dr. Mehta was pointing out, that we won't examine those practices, and we'll continue those practices. So the question is not whether it's happening. It's happening, and we need to be mindful of it.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I'll add maybe an example. So I used to, I think I would fall under the category that I used to believe that mathematics was apolitical, that it was just neutral, and I operated in this world for a little while, and then I think the kind of the time where it really, like I saw that it wasn't, was when I didn't see anybody that was Chicano with a math PhD until I was in graduate school. So that was tough. Like, if you don't include these examples for your students, you're telling them that they don't belong.
I 100% agree. And I would like to, this is where I guess we're closing now. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. So thank you all. And if we could put up the slide for our flyer. So I'd like to invite everyone who's attended today to our next webinar. This is webinar 5, Racialized Trauma, Mentoring and Counseling, on November 5th. We have Dr. Ramar Henderson and Dr. Dominique Griffin speaking to us. And so this will be an excellent webinar to attend. And then I also invite everyone who is attending now to complete our post-webinar survey. And we've included the link in the chat so you can access that directly. Just a reminder, if you attend and view each of the webinars and complete the survey, you are eligible to receive a certificate of completion after watching all of the webinars. And then I will pass it off to Dr. Sotero Lopez to close us out.
Thank you all. Thank you again to all our panelists. Thank you all for taking the time, taking your Thursday evening to join us for, again, the 4th webinar of 6. Dr. Goff just shared our next presentation. Again, panel will be on racialized trauma, mentoring, and counseling on November 5th. And the last one will be on November 12th. The focus of that one is ethnic studies and anti-racist pedagogy. Again, as a reminder, Dr. Goff mentioned this, if you have been with us for all 6 webinars and complete the survey, you will get a certificate. If you have not, you can still access all our webinar recordings on our website, and we'll make sure to put that on the chat. Thank you all again for being here. Please vote if you haven't yet voted. A lot of the topics, right, that we discussed today and have discussed in our webinars are our part, right? Our voice in selecting our new leadership is important, right? To make sure that we see this stuff become reality, right? So thank you all again for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.